welcome everyone to our special plenary event with a special old friend of the Institute, Ursula Heise, who's indeed a member of our executive committee, has taught for us, lectured for us before, taking time out while chair of the English department at UCLA, also closely associated with the Institute for Environment and Sustainability there. Long before that, was a scholar postmodern narrative. Her first book, Chronoschisms, I recommend highly. Was also the co-editor with Jalal Qadir of the fantastic 20th century volume of the Longman Anthology of World Literature. So she's been involved in the world. We have been involved for a long time and increasingly working in environmental studies. You have her several books on this, from Sense of Place and Sense of Planet onward, Imagining Extinction in the program. And without much further ado, I'll just say, I don't know if I was trying to think, could I think of anyone else I know who has become so distinguished while being still so cool? I just don't, it's a hard thing to do both. Ursula Heise, over to you.
Thank you so much, David. That was a great introduction. I love it. And it's wonderful to be back with the IWL. I mean, I was there, what was it, 2 years ago? At Harvard, and then of course the year before that in Tokyo. And I regret that I can't be there this year in person, but nobody has been anywhere in person for a while. We're hoping to start up again soon. But on the upside, since my topic is climate change, by not flying to the other coast, where I'm drastically reducing my carbon footprint and avoiding tons of contributions to greenhouse gas emissions. And that's really something that many of us are thinking about now, how we can combine the personal encounters and the warmth of being together in one place with really lightening the burden on the planet. And so that is something that I want to talk about today. The title of my talk is Climate Change and Urban Narrative. And I picked climate change not because I think it is the only or even perhaps the most important problem confronting us environment-wise today, but because it is the central concept around which a lot of varieties of environmentalism today are organized. And it's often equated with the much touted concept of the Anthropocene, although that term originally included a whole set of environmental changes, all the way from pollution and soil erosion to deforestation and biodiversity loss, changes in the nitrogen cycle, along with climate change. But today, these two terms have almost become interchangeable. And many people, when they use Anthropocene, they mean climate change. And when they say climate change, they imply the Anthropocene. Now, over the last decade, these discussions about the Anthropocene and climate change, and also particularly the criticisms of the concept of the Anthropocene, have increasingly been in dialogue and often in relations of conflict and critique with discourses of environmental justice. So I'll start by talking in somewhat general terms about climate change, climate justice, and how it hangs together with issues of narrative. And I'll then focus on one particular type of narrative that has been oddly prevalent, which is the city underwater as a synecdoche for climate change at the global level. And I'd like to talk to you about two examples of that. One from film, a Vietnamese film called Nuoc 2030, and Nuoc is an interesting word that can mean land or water, and an American science fiction novel from 2017 called New York 2140 by the science fiction novelist Kim Stanley Robinson. And I'd like to sort of lay out with these two examples how they turn the template of the city underwater, which usually is used as the starting point for narratives of apocalypse, post-apocalypse, dystopia, disaster, how they turn it into a very different direction to talk precisely about issues of justice and to paint, if not utopian, then at least more optimistic futures for us. So justice has turned into a very central issue for environmentalism over the last decade. Now that connection is new. Ecofeminism in the 1970s and social ecology, which sort of emerged in the 1960s and 70s, as well as the environmental justice movement as it formed in the 1980s, had begun to connect struggles for social justice with fights for environmental conservation as far back as the 60s, 70s, and then with a vengeance in the 80s. But justice has evolved into a key concern now for a much wider spectrum of environmentalisms. And that's really happened from the turn of the millennium onward. So now you have the movement for climate justice, for energy justice, the idea of a just transition from fossil fuel economic regimes to more renewable resource-based ones. The idea of food justice, that is what kind of food different communities have access to and what that has to do with environmental issues. Spatial justice and housing justice, all of these connect environmentalism with issues like land use, fossil fuel dependence, agriculture, transportation, the future of work, the right to shelter, food distribution, and so forth. And then the last term on this slide, multi-species justice, was one that Donna Haraway and myself sort of proposed in two books that both came out in 2016. So Haraway uses multi-species environmental justice, and multi-species justice was the term I used, which were meant, I think, as invitations on the part of both of us to think about biodiversity conservation in terms of both human and non-human communities, and about the differentials of power and affluence and rights between those different communities. So what is implied by using the term justice in so many different contexts? Well, it builds a conceptual bridge between the fights against unequal wealth and power on one hand and against environmental degradation on the other. And it also links environmental values and decision-making to a tradition of philosophical, political, and legal arguments that run all the way from Aristotle to John Rawls and beyond. So initially, arguments about environmental justice tended to focus on distributive justice in the general framework of John Rawls's theory of justice from 1971, which is still sort of a monumental work. So the question of how ecological resources and benefits on one hand and how risks on the other hand are socially distributed. But then environmental justice really developed by leaps and bounds over the decades that followed from the initial formulations in the 1990s, and especially David Schlossberg's monumental work, Environmental Justice Theories and Concepts from 2007, and David Pello's work in the early 2000s also, and over the last decade, now also have moved to include other dimensions. So let me show those to you a little bit. So distributive justice continues to be a really basic dimension of environmental justice. So the question of who has access to environmental resources and benefits, and who is most exposed to and best protected from environmental scarcities and risks. But now there are three other dimensions that are commonly considered to form part of environmental justice, especially when considered in its global context. So the second one is participatory justice. So who gets to make decisions about environmental issues? Who has the power to say no? Really important, because without that, you don't really have a whole lot of power, even if you sit at the table. And then who has the power to implement environmental decisions? The third component is capabilities justice. So the question of not only do you have a right to basic health or to protection from environmental risks and disasters, but do you have the possibility and the access to the means of leading a flourishing life? So access to healthcare, a free movement, the ability to form the social bonds that you want, to have emotional ties, and so forth. Go beyond just basic human rights. And some theorists like David Schlossberg also want to include non-human communities in that. So, so the question of, do humans have a chance to flourish, but also do the other organisms that co-inhabit the planet with us have that same access? And then finally, recognition justice, which is the move to include and acknowledge systems of knowledge and management of nature that go beyond Western science. So especially, of course, the recognition of indigenous systems of knowledge and management of nature in Australia and Latin America and Canada, and in the United States, or North America more generally, Canada also. That's now a very important part of environmental justice, as is a respect in making decisions about land use and habitat for the spiritual and religious meanings of nature, of particular species, but also particular places for local communities. And, a lot of the times that problem has revolved around indigenous communities, but not always. Sometimes it's local communities that are not necessarily indigenous in all cases. The climate justice movement that emerged about 15 years ago or so built on this body of work to address one of the most crucial problems in the debates about climate change. And you all know what that is, so let me just summarize it very briefly. Global warming is caused by the gradual buildup of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere that started with industrialization in Europe in the 18th century and then gradually spread to other continents. So historically and in the present, the global north has the main responsibility for the emission of greenhouse gases. And that's, as you all know, compounded by the disproportionately large consumption of fossil fuel resources in industrialized countries today. Countries in the global south have contributed a lot less and continue, some of them at least, to contribute very few greenhouse gas emissions now, but suffer some of the most serious consequences of floods, droughts, desertification, and so forth. But because of their own development and their demographic growth, some countries in the global south are now also contributing in a major way to climate change. And, a country like China now, of course, is the leader in greenhouse gas emissions, and India is still behind, but is catching up fast. So that raises really complicated questions about who should shoulder the cost of climate mitigation and climate adaptation, and how that cost distribution should be computed. So should you count who emits the most greenhouse gas emissions currently? Should you do it per capita? Should you count past emissions over, and then how far back, 150 years, 200 years? Or other measures. And these considerations are already really, really complex when they arouse expenses for damage that's already been done. So the cost of abating existing air pollution or adaptation to conditions that have already changed. So rebuilding after a wildfire or a flood that's already happened. But they get even more complicated, as you can imagine, when they also include the costs and benefits of mitigation measures for consequences that have yet to materialize. So the costs of managed retreat from coastlines. So we're trying to move some communities back from coastlines that are likely to be impacted by rising sea levels, by increased droughts and hurricanes, as you know. So who's going to pay for that? Those are damages that have not even yet materialized. We're trying to anticipate them. Who's going to pay? And those are just some of the complications of intragenerational climate justice. So how you think about justice in the context of individuals and communities that are here now. Considerations of intergenerational justice have brought about additional sets of difficulties. And some of these from advocates such as Greta Thunberg and the Extinction Rebellion movement. And environmental activists, even before those movements emerged on the scene, have liked to appeal to parents' sense of responsibility for their children and their children's future children. And they also often refer in the North American context to the Native American precept of thinking about the consequences of your actions for the next 7 generations. So about, by a common computation, about 175 years. But planning for a time span of over a century is, of course, extremely difficult given current rates of social and technological change. And while the claims of children are being very vocally articulated by, children who are now coming into adulthood, the claims of people on our moral consideration who do not currently exist yet are philosophically fraught with difficulty. So let me just rephrase that maybe a little more intuitively. Of course, it's easy to see the claims of the people that you see on the slide that you're looking at here, the people who are now alive and who are worried about their own futures. But it's much more difficult in philosophical terms to articulate what claim on our moral consideration humans and indeed non-humans have who are not yet here, who have not yet been born, and whose needs it's very difficult to predict, right? So legally and in terms of philosophy, this is all much more complicated than it looks when you see the banners in the streets. So all of these issues have been explored in great detail in the literature on environmental justice. And on climate justice in particular. And as I mentioned, I've explored some of them in the context of what I call multi-species justice, in terms of how you combine ideas of justice for disenfranchised human communities with ideas of justice in non-human communities or about non-human communities. So I'm not going to rehearse those arguments here, they're in print, but rather starting from my interest in how narrative patterns shape our thinking about environmental issues. What I'd like to explore with you is how these ideas about climate justice are associated with certain narrative patterns, and how these story templates shape what climate justice means in different cultural contexts. And coming back to this slide, you know, there's also something that Greta Thunberg herself has foregrounded, which is, of course, that even though she started her advocacy at an amazingly young age, at age 15 or 16, but she is a young white woman from one of the countries who actually will be least affected by some of the more disastrous consequences of climate change, being from Sweden, right? So she says, even as she delivers her most impassioned pleas and warns world leaders that we will never forgive you if you don't act now, she also admits that she's actually among the privileged, and that there are, you know, young women in Bangladesh who will suffer much more grievously from the consequences of climate change. How important stories are for current engagement with climate change has been foregrounded by a lot of theorists and activists, perhaps particularly clearly by the British geographer Mike Hume. So Mike Hume, in 2 books that he's published over the last decade, has emphasized that public debates about climate change can't be dissociated from the stories we tell about climate change. So he says in Why We Disagree About Climate Change, his 2009 book, climates change over time, both the physical climates of places, but also the ideologies with which climate is associated. And he says the ways in which the story of climate change and human civilization has been told has also changed over time. We cannot detach the stories we tell about climate from the stories we tell about societies. So, and he traces this back in history, and other people have too, how discourses about climate, of course, were completely different under colonialism, when the idea of changing climate and improving climate was a positive idea going forward, rather than the mostly pessimistic ideas that are now associated with it. So I point you here to the work of environmental historians who have really investigated that in great detail. Now, some researchers, especially in our field of literature, have seen this association between climate change and storytelling as a problem. So the novelist Amitav Ghosh and the literary critics Adam Trexler and Timothy Clark have all questioned whether currently popular forms of narrative can address the spatial and temporal scales of climate change and the non-human forms of agency it involves. That is, how can mainstream realist novels talk about deep time? How can they talk about the globe as a whole, and how can they talk about the agency of storms and tsunamis and the climate itself? Now, I've shown how the temporal patterns and of speculative fiction actually respond very well to some of these concerns in an essay that appeared a couple of years ago in English Literary History. So again, I won't repeat that argument today, but I'd like to zero in on a different form of storytelling that is, however, related to the more general argument about how speculative fiction and film actually do have some of the narrative tools to address these kinds of changes. So the particular problem that I've been interested in is how narratives about climate change connect the stories of individuals to those about the global social order and the role that injustice plays in those stories. So it's both a story, an argument about scale. So how do we scale up from the stories of individuals or small communities of families and so forth to stories about the fate of the planet as a whole? And how do we talk about patterns of inequality and the struggle against it in that context? So one of the principal settings in which these climate stories take place is the city. And that's the first thing to say. Not all climate change stories, of course, are about cities, but a surprising number of them are. And this makes sense in terms of real life and the realities that surround us, and in terms of the Anthropocene, in that urbanization is one of the most important dimensions of the Anthropocene, and you may already be well aware of this. According to the United Nations and the World Health Organization, 2008 was the first year in the history of our species in which more than 50% of humans lived in cities, and that number is projected to rise to at least 70% over the course of the century. So on the slide here, the middle line, the blue line, is the rise of urban populations as it's already occurred and is projected to occur by 2050 across the globe. And then the other colored lines are the way in which urban populations will evolve on different continents. So you can see how Africa and Asia are the continents where urban populations will grow most explosively. Here's another graph that shows the same idea as sort of this chiasmus between the declining share of the rural world population and the rising one of urban populations. Now, there's been some debate over what counts as a city in the WHO survey in particular, but nobody contests that general tendency. Cities around the world are growing, and all future population growth will either end up in cities or start out there in the first place. And we're not talking mainly well-known metropolises like Tokyo, Shanghai, Lagos, or Mexico City here. Much of that growth is already happening in cities in China and India that have the same population as New York, 7 or 8 million inhabitants, but whose names don't register with residents of the global north unless there's some disaster associated with them. So the major future habitat of humankind is the city. And as Mike Davis, as well as many urban political ecologists, have pointed out, often these are cities in which sharp socioeconomic inequality is already a daily reality and may become more so in the future. Mike Davis published that book, Planet of Slums, a number of years ago, where he pointed to those realities. Environmental inequality forms part of that, in that residents of megacities, especially in the global south, have unequal access to infrastructures of water, electricity, and sanitation, unequal exposure to pollution, and unequal access to housing, green spaces, and biodiversity. Now, these inequalities have been discussed in depth in the literature on present and future urbanisms, and they come up in public forums all the time. For example, in discussions of homelessness in the United States and in other major cities around the world. So it makes sense that the city would be a central setting for writers and filmmakers who want to focus on scenarios of climate injustice. But writers, of course, also draw on literary and cultural traditions, not just on contemporary realities. And in many works, they draw particularly on the tradition of the city as a microcosmos of the planet. So if you think back to the 19th century urban novels of Balzac, Dickens, or Dostoevsky, and onward to the modernist urban novels of Joyce, Woolf, Dublin, or Dos Passos, you find in all of them that cities function as narrative hubs that bring a large number of otherwise unconnected characters together and explore their stories side by side, and often, of course, not always, but often precisely to explore the inequalities of modern societies. So contemporary climate writers and film directors have tended to focus on that kind of urban narrative and on one particular version of it, namely the story of the drowned city. You probably all remember the giant tsunami that rolled over the Statue of Liberty and through Manhattan in Roland Emmerich's Day After Tomorrow from 2004, the first Hollywood feature film that addressed climate change. But it was already a major feature in earlier cli-fi narratives, climate fiction narratives, like Melbourne Underwater in the Australian novelist George Turner's The Sea in Summer from 1987, and in a lot of novels afterwards. So think of Paolo Bacigalupi's novel set in Bangkok, The Wind-Up Girl. Think of Helsinki flooded in Antti Tuomainen's Parantaja, The Healer. Or think about New York in the face of Hurricane Sandy and then being flooded in Nathaniel Rich's Odds Against Tomorrow. Or think of books like Franz Schätzing's Der Schwarm or Stephen Baxter's Flood, both books that that feature a whole range of cities around the globe underwater. Nonfiction writers have equally seized on that trope of the city underwater as the major synecdoche for climate change. So Mark Linus's books, High Tide, How Climate Crisis is Engulfing Our Planet, and 6 Degrees, Our Future on a Hotter Planet, use that, as well as Jeff Goodell's The Water Will Come, Rising Seas, Sinking Cities, and the Remaking of Civilizations, just for example. And Jeff Goodell might ring a bell for you because he's been on radio and TV just in the last 2 weeks, because his book predicted things like the collapse of the Champlain Tower in Surfside, Florida, with a great deal of accuracy as one of the likely consequences of increased floods, corrosion, and hurricanes in places like Florida. Or think of other books like Ashley Dawson's Extreme Cities, The Peril and Promise of Urban Life in the Age of Climate Change, David Wallace Wells's The Uninhabitable Earth, Life After Warming, and Elizabeth Rush's Rising Dispatches from the New American Shore. I mean, all of these discuss major metropolises as a central way of portraying the risky futures of climate change, or they just focus on them completely, as Goodell and Dawson do. So New York, Venice, Jakarta, Dhaka, Miami, all come up repeatedly in these books. There's nothing wrong with that in terms of fact, of course. We all know that a lot of coastal cities around the globe are in fact at risk from rising waters. But it's less clear that this is the only or the major consequence of climate change for cities. Acute water shortages are, of course, equally prominent. Think of the news reports in recent years about Cape Town, South Africa, Chennai, India, or Sao Paulo, Brazil, all cities that have suffered devastating water shortages over the last 5 years. So are the risks from large-scale wildfires. Think of the examples of Sydney and Melbourne in the last couple of years, and of course, my own hometown of Los Angeles. Now, there are, of course, stories about these scenarios too in films, but they're not nearly as dominant and as numerous as the stories that feature cities underwater. So as a literary and cultural scholar, I'm of course curious about why that is. And one reason I'd suggest is that world-engulfing floods and drowned cities just have a very long narrative history that many of these contemporary stories build on. So from Plato's Atlantis story from 360 BCE to Abe Kobo's Daion Kampyoki, Enter Ice Age 4, one of the first Japanese science fiction novels from 1959, and J.G. Ballard's Drowned World from 1962, cities underwater have served as a major trope of the end of historical eras, the cyclical passing of civilizations, divine punishment, as in Plato, the transience of beliefs and cultures, or the eventual downfall of even the most powerful empires. And, just as a footnote, in Abe Kobo and in J.G. Ballard, the reason for drowning is already climate change, although not climate change caused by humans in the way that we understand it today. So climate science predictions of increased floods and sea level rise lend a new realism to this age-old story. But the real possibility of flooded cities, in turn, reinforces their symbolic weight. So Jeff Goodell in The Water Will Come calls Miami a modern Atlantis in the making. And Ashley Dawson similarly claims that New Orleans will be a new Atlantis surrounded by ever higher levees and with no natural barriers to hold back the slow violence of sea level rise. So Atlantis, in Plato's account, sank as a punishment from the gods because of its enmity against Athens. For Goodell and Dawson, flooded Miami and New Orleans are punished by political institutions and urban planning processes that currently miss the mark. So Dawson argues that the problem is ultimately neoliberal capitalism. Without overturning capitalism, he argues, there's no prospect of any just urban transition out of the fossil fuel age and the prospect of flooded cities. Goodell is more resigned to the complications of realpolitik. So he says, in a world of quickly rising seas, the rationale for encouraging people to move out of harm's way is straightforward. It saves money and it saves lives. For elected officials, the rationale for not encouraging people to move out of harm's way is also straightforward. If you ask voters to do something difficult, something time-consuming, or worst of all, something that costs them money, you get voted out of office or sued. His very incisive analysis shows how political interests, the structure of, in the US, federal flood insurance, real estate investment strategies around the world, the astronomical cost of effective seawalls or large-scale buyouts, which is also as true of Jakarta, Indonesia, as it is of Manhattan, and the threat of litigation combined with individuals' unwillingness to face coming threats, and then dooms homes and cities. So in the process, Goodell often emphasizes issues of climate justice, how affluent neighborhoods have the means to put pressure on political authorities or to initiate lawsuits for preventive measures, which are sometimes carried out at public cost. Poor communities don't have those possibilities. So he says, when it comes to dealing with the impacts of sea level rise, two things matter: money and elevation. That is how high up you are. That's sort of his laconic summary. But then it's weird how in his final vision of future flooded cities, these issues of inequality are oddly erased. So he has this sort of science fiction scenario at the end where he says, seawalls will crumble. In a few decades, low-lying neighborhoods will be knee-deep. Modern office buildings or condo towers will lean as the salt water corrodes the concrete foundations and eats at the structural beams. Fish will school in classrooms. Keep that image in mind, I'll come back to it. Religious leaders will blame sinners for the drowning of the city. Journalists will arrive on float planes and write about the return of nature. But mostly the city will be forgotten, one of many places lost to the attacking sea. In some distant future, someone or some human-like machines may explore the sunken city and find bowling balls, stainless steel knives, gold wedding bands, and ceramic tiles. They may wonder about the people who lived there, what their lives were like, and what they were thinking as their world went under. So that sounds like the premise of a sci-fi novel. And in fact, George Turner's novel, The Sea in Summer, which I mentioned earlier, has exactly that kind of scenario with Melbourne being visited by future humans and then wondering about the greenhouse culture of the late 20th century, as they call it, from their future viewpoint. But Goodell is striking in that his is an oddly lyrical evocation of post-apocalypse that contrasts with the more apocalyptic future that he starts his book with. So he starts with a devastating hurricane that hits Miami in 2037. It's also an ending that emphasizes memory and de-emphasizes the issues of climate justice. So you may be sort of a bit dissatisfied, as I was, with this ending for politically, if you're a politically or environmentally engaged reader, but one that illustrates how much the fate of the city is identified with the fate of the world, and how much the age-old story of the drowned city can turn into an almost mythical narrative about the inevitability of rising seas and the equal unavoidability of people's short-sightedness and incompetence. Dawson comes to a very different conclusion about modern-day Atlantis from his analysis, and I'll return to him in a little while. But before I do that, I'd like to zero in on a futuristic climate film where the drowned city is similarly suspended between anticipation and memory. So it has certain resonances with Goodell's ending. And that is when Wozniak Min's Nuuk 2030, a film from 2014, that emphasizes the suspension between meditations on property and value on one hand, and then inequality and climate change on the other. So Nuuk 2030 is largely set in the titular year in 2030 in the Mekong Delta, which is about 100 kilometers, about 35 miles south of Ho Chi Minh City, aka Saigon. The Mekong Delta it's the area at the very bottom of the slide here. So you see Ho Chi Minh City there in the south at the southern end of Vietnam. And the area south of it that is crisscrossed by rivers, as you can see on this map, is the delta. It's a vast area of wetlands and rivers that are at sea level. It has a lot of towns, lots of agriculture, very dense population, and is projected to be at extreme risk from king tides, floods, and rising sea levels, as you know, a lot of the Vietnam coast is, but the Mekong Delta in particular. And so at the beginning of the film, you get a brief paragraph that indicates that by 2030, 80% of the population has been evacuated or displaced from the area because of climate change. The plot begins with something like a murder mystery. So you have this young fisherwoman, Sao, on the still that I'm displaying here. She, at the beginning of the film, retrieves the body of her husband, T, from the floating hydroponic farm where he was killed during work. She goes on to seek and find employment at that same farm, you know, on one hand to make a living, but also to find out why and how her husband died. So that's sort of the mystery plot there. We are shown in the first part of the film, Sao and T in the weeks before T's death in 2030. And they look like they lead what looks like the fairly normal life of a poor young couple in the global South. They fish, they grow greens, they try to conceive a baby, they live in a house on stilts, which you also see in the still here in the background, in the flooded bay where T's land once was. Issues of climate justice are implicit in these scenes. They stage an argument that by now quite a few indigenous and post-colonial scholars have made. What's perceived as climate change apocalypse or dystopia in the global North is often already lived reality for communities in the global South. Poverty, displacement, precarious food supplies, and uncertain futures are nothing new at all for communities that have experienced colonialism in its various forms. So from that perspective, climate change and its consequences are not as new in terms of lived experience as they are in terms of their scientific causes. By the same token, adapting to climate change involves structures of inequality and struggles for justice that have driven progressive political movements for centuries. Before I move on to what happens in the film, I'll just want you to also notice one detail in the background of the still that you're looking at, and that is that Saigon is visible in the background, right? So Saigon is not flooded, it's on the horizon. I'll come back to that. It's an important feature of the film's story world. So in the second part of the film, the inequalities and implicit injustice of climate change come a little bit more clearly to the fore. The plot flashes back to the year 2020 when a university student named Zhang from Saigon visits the Mekong Delta, and what he's doing is research on plants that he wants to engineer for future climate resilient farming. So Zhang and Sao meet at a bookstore cafe where she works as a waitress. They fall in love, and she shows him a particular kind of local seaweed that is able to thrive in both freshwater and seawater. That seaweed is a breakthrough for Zhang's research. He genetically modifies it and is able to turn it into a crop plant that can absorb salt water. And that's, of course, you know, as you can imagine, a really important asset in the flooded landscapes of southern Vietnam and the world at large. But at the end of his research, Zhang leaves Sao. He returns to Saigon, and where we as viewers had anticipated a continuing romance and perhaps marriage between Zhang and Sao, he instead marries into the wealthy family that had funded his research, and that also 10 years later owns the hydroponic farm where T works in 2030. In the third part of the film, it returns to the time after T's death in 2030. So we have this long flashback to 2020, and then we go back to 2030. Sao now hears two divergent stories about her husband's death. T's brother tells Sao that he heard Zhang on the floating farm ordering his men to kill T, ostensibly so as to punish him for having stolen genetically modified seeds for resale on the black market. Zhang himself later tells Sao a different story. He claims that he hired T to smuggle seeds out from his family's farm so that they could be made available to the poor, but that T was caught and accidentally killed in the ensuing tussle. How reliable a narrator Zhang is not easy to tell, and it's not clear whether Zhang and Sao's continuing or perhaps renewed attraction might have played a role in bringing about T's demise. In other words, did Zhang have him killed? Question mark, did Zhang have him killed because of seeds or out of jealousy or something else? We don't really find out with certainty. But Sao pretends, at least pretends, perhaps she does in reality, that she believes Zhang's account. That murder mystery is presented in a very slow, quiet, and lyrical mode, and it's kept mostly in these sort of blue and green tones that you already see on the still. So it's in very stark opposition to the disaster spectacles that dominate a lot of North American films about climate change, like Day After Tomorrow, or also The Age of Stupid, or other future films. About climate change. Gradually, but inexorably, the film transitions the viewer from the familiar hardships of life for the poor in the global South to a far stranger and more unsettling world. And conflicts over property emerge as one of the central nodes of the narrative. So T, for example, tries to fight off fishermen who come to fish on what used to be his family's property, now flooded. They argue that the ocean belongs to all. He claims that this is his land. In revenge, they destroy his nets and eat his fish. And at that point, he decides that holding on to his flooded land is not worth the trouble, and he begins to try and sell it. Property and ownership also cause conflict in other ways. So in the flashback to 2020, one scene shows Zhang presenting his research about that seaweed to the executives of the company he works for. Once he shows that he's made the breakthrough that they were hoping for, there's this moment of conflict and tension. Zhang wants to use genetic engineering to seed the ocean itself with produce so everyone can harvest it. That's what sort of lends a certain amount of plausibility to his story, that he actually asked T to smuggle out the seeds. But the board members instead suggest partnership with a leading research university, and they want to further develop floating farms so as to turn the plant into a profitable commodity. At the end of the film, that question reemerges. So you have another conflict over who owns the genetically modified plant, which, as you know, is a much discussed problem with regard to a lot of genetically engineered animals and plants today. At the end of the film, that question reemerges in Zhang's claim that he hired T because he wanted the genetically modified seed to become publicly available. But is this GMO plant Zhang's to give away in the first place? After all, it was Sao, with her intimate knowledge of the ocean in that region, who led him to the original plant in the first place. Zhang, who's just a graduate student from Saigon, could have not found it on his own. So you could argue that Zhang's academic research originally appropriated Sao's vernacular knowledge without any compensation for her or people in the region. So again, the question of what belongs to whom and how ownership functions becomes extremely uncertain in a world that is more ocean than land. And these accumulating questions of ownership against the background of adaptation to life in and with the sea gradually convey a sense of a different world in which old laws, practices, and institutions of ownership and dispensation of justice have only intermittent traction on the new realities. But it's especially the image of a city underwater at the end of the film that drives home to what extent climate change really unsettles ordinary conceptions of reality. And this is where my analysis sort of overlaps a little bit with some of the new research in oceanic humanities or blue humanities, which argues that engaging in depth with a new environment, or not so new environment, it's always been there, but we're being forced to engage with it in new ways, really forces sort of different epistemologies and even different ontologies. Don't have time to talk about that right now, but I'm happy to talk more about it in the discussion if we have time. So toward the end of the film, a typhoon approaches the hydroponic farm and all the workers are evacuated. Zhang and Sao are still on the farm. And in the scene that I'm about to show you, they embark in a sort of little submersible vehicle that floats gently down and then glides across an underwater cityscape. And one of the buildings you'll see is one of the most iconic ones in Ho Chi Minh City, the Bitexco Tower, which some people refer to jokingly as a sort of stack of CDs with one CD popped out. That's indeed the way it looks a little bit. And you'll see how that building appears in the scene that I'm about to show you. So the city here is unmistakably Saigon, with a Bitexco Tower very clearly visible. And the whole scene relies on the very familiar image of a city drowned by rising sea levels. But this is where I would like to remind you of the earlier slide I showed you. That scene makes no logical sense in the story world of the film, which is set well south of Saigon. And as we saw in several earlier scenes, this city skyline was shown on the horizon well above water. And of course, there's other things that are surreal about the scene that we've just seen, among other things, that the city is lit up as if the electricity could still be on. Sao and Zhang then float by the bookstore cafe where she worked as a waitress and they first met in 2020. The cafe, the hammocks, and even the books are still all implausibly intact. And the scene makes it seem as if it's now the fish reading the books. Remember Godal's vision of fish in classrooms, right? And that includes a book called 2020 in a metafictional allusion to the film itself. So climate change realism here morphs into the imagery typical of French surrealism, with its surprising juxtapositions and self-contradictory metaphors. So the city is underwater, even though it shouldn't be. At the end, the sand underwater comes to look almost like a desert. And then in this very final scene, which is the final view of the film, the tide seems to have receded, the ocean seemed to have receded, but Saigon is nowhere to be seen anymore. So this mesmerizing combination of beauty and incongruity in the underwater scenes sends the film's clearest signal to viewers that its futuristic story world no longer corresponds to the old world before climate change, not because of disasters, destruction, and death. The typhoon, for example, is not portrayed as a major threat, but because the omnipresence of the ocean unmoors both collective institutions and individual practices. And in the same sort of slightly disorienting fashion, Nuoc 2030 turns its portrayal of southern Vietnam into a synecdoche for global change. At 3 different moments in the film, one of which you're looking at, the camera pulls slowly back from the unfolding scene to show the landscape or seascape through a fisheye lens, so that you see the curvature of the planet. These are not vistas that any of the characters perceive, but ones that the film audience is supposed to see. Let me show you a couple of others. This is back in 2020 when Zhang and Sao first fall in love. Or check this one out. So this one, of course, is an anticipation of the final scene, but with Saigon still on the horizon and Tien Sao's home still visible above the waves. So these are all 3 of these scenes are sort of slightly surreal and disorienting, because you know that can't possibly be what any of the characters see. But it is what the film wants us, the audience, to see, the planetary story behind the Southern Vietnamese plot. So instead of drawing on the familiar story templates and film images of hurricanes, flood waves, displaced crowds, and destroyed cities, Wen Vo draws on the estrangement techniques developed by the high modernist avant-garde. He creates an aesthetically appealing, but also deeply unsettling vision of land, wealth, and culture going underwater and a totally different world emerging. And as we saw, conflicts of property and ownership are crucial to how that new world gets shaped. So a critique of capitalist modes of acquiring, processing, and distributing natural resources is at least implicit in Nuoc 2030, though it is a subtle and lyrical film. It does not hit you over the head with these issues, but they keep recurring with a frequency that you can't miss. It's far more explicit in Dawson's nonfiction book, Extreme Cities, which I alluded to earlier. Much more insistently than when Vaux or Goodell, he emphasizes class and race, climate redlining, and the failures of politicians and institutions that he sees as complicit with neoliberal capitalism. Like Goodell, he emphasizes the importance of strategic retreat from coastlines and from the oceans in his conclusion. But unlike Goodell's relegation of the drowned city to future memory, Dawson ends with an extensive catalog of changes that he sees as necessary at the local, national, and global levels. That catalog, to my ears at least, sounds increasingly implausible as it stretches over more and more pages and invokes the words community and collective so often that you come to wonder what realities they might correspond to. In a less obvious way than Goodell, Dawson too, I think, concludes by way of a speculative fiction, although it's a much more explicitly sort of socialist inflected one. Managed retreat from risky areas and decarbonization of urban energy economies are just a start in Dawson's sweeping view. So he says, dramatic natural and social disasters such as Hurricane Sandy have unleashed significant creative energies, galvanized by the need to adapt cities to the climate crisis. Yet few of these proposals dare to imagine an entirely different social order. Human survival and the survival of many of our fellow creatures on Earth demands that we imagine new forms of collective flourishing. Denizens of the good cities of the future may discover new forms of human plenitude while helping one another weather the coming storms. Dawson here mobilizes a different dimension of the drowned city scenario, its promise of a new and more just social order that is never, however, imagined quite as vividly as the destruction of the old. He echoes Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything, in portraying climate apocalypse as the moment that might give the necessary impulse to social changes that he and Klein would have advocated for, even in the absence of climate change. What the new social order would look like and what mechanisms might bring it into being remains frustratingly open, I think, in both Klein's book and in Dawson's. Dawson evokes the disaster communism, as he calls it, of spontaneously organized neighborhood help in New York after Hurricane Sandy as a model for climate justice. But how these local networks could be scaled up without losing precisely the community character that he so much insists on remains indeterminate. But Dawson and Klein are not alone in seeing climate change in general, and the drowned city in particular, as the launch pads for creative possibilities rather than just urban apocalypse. The reinvention of value and of the economic order is also at the heart of Kim Stanley Robinson's novel, New York 2040. Robinson's novel portrays Manhattan in the middle of the 22nd century, after two major pulses of ice thaw and sea level rise have raised ocean water by 60 feet. By current scientific standards, that's extreme, but not impossible. Under these circumstances, Upper Manhattan, which lies 150 feet above sea level, has continued its vertical growth and has generated these new super scrapers of unprecedented height. Midtown Manhattan, from 4th Street southward, has turned into an intertidal zone where waters come and go. Sorry, that should be 40th Street southward. Has turned into an intertidal zone where waters come and go, and the survival of collapse of buildings has turned into an object of real estate speculation. And Lower Manhattan has completely flooded. So that's the kind of scenario that normally is the setting for large-scale urban disaster narrative of the kind of Day After Tomorrow, right? But it's much more ambivalent in this novel. There's absolutely no doubt in the text that sea level rise and increased hurricanes have inflicted heavy damage on New York and the many other coastal cities for which it stands as a proxy in the age of climate change. But with its proverbial resilience, New York has not just survived, but actually benefited from the flood. The characters variously call it an aquatropolis or a super Venice, fashionably hip, artistic, sexy, a new urban legend. Some people were happy to live on the water if it was conceptualized as Venetian, enduring the mold and hassle to live in a work of art. In fact, to some extent, climate change has catalyzed social change and utopian experimentation. Hegemony had drowned, and so in the years after the flooding, there was a proliferation of cooperatives, neighborhood associations, communes, squats, also free open universities, free trade schools, and free art schools. And I'm leaving out a lot here. This is a very, very long enumeration of all the new social experiments and communities that have emerged. But of course, hegemony has not quite drowned. The intertidal areas of New York and other coastal cities have turned into privileged zones for real estate speculation. And, and Robinson goes to some lengths to show how capitalism itself has adapted to a changing world. Franklin Garr, a stockbroker whose first-person narrative and Bildungsroman style development over the course of the plot functions as the novel's narrative backbone, doesn't just participate in that speculation on the death and life of great American buildings, he's also created a new stock index, the IPPI, or Intertidal Property Pricing Index, which is designed to help investors profit from all that speculation. Because if the intertidal has any value at all, he says, even if it's only $1 million or $2 million, then someone wants to own that. And other people want to leverage that value right out to the usual 50 times, whatever it might be. Sounds like a familiar story, right? This kind of speculation can make even risky buildings too expensive to live in for the young and the poor. Rising waters drive some of the characters from their homes in addition. Others find new homes squatting in buildings that can no longer be officially rented. And yet others seem unable to find a home because housing may be unaffordable to them in the first place. So there's clear resonances with housing situations in a lot of major cities around the world, not just, but of course, including the United States. A dozen or so different characters whose stories we follow in the novel are tied together by real estate. All of them live temporarily or permanently at the Metropolitan Life Insurance Building, which functions as a co-op on the model of what currently exists in New York. So I've put a picture of that building into the center here, and then sort of bubbles representing the other major characters whose stories we follow around them. So there's Franklin Garr, the stockbroker. There's Charlotte Armstrong, a refugee advocate who is elected representative of Congress toward the end of the novel. There's Jen Octaviusdottir, an African-American policewoman. Vladimirovich, an building superintendent who originally came from Eastern Europe. Two computer hackers nicknamed Mutt and Jeff, to whom I'll return in a minute. Amelia Black, an internet celebrity who broadcasts live reports on endangered species from around the world. Two illiterate and orphaned boys, Stefan and Roberto, who spend much of their time with a retired historian, whose maps, they hope, will lead them to treasures underwater. So all of these characters come from different personal histories and different social backgrounds. They inhabit the urban space in very different ways, even as they also represent larger forces of the market, of politics, and the media. And in addition, there's the voice of someone called simply the citizen or that citizen, which in some later passages in the novel morphs into the city, a voice that provides a good deal of urban history and a lot of comment on the contemporary sphere, but isn't attached to any clearly defined character. It's the voice of the city itself. Robinson's model for that kind of urban configuration, narrative configuration, is clearly Dos Passos' Manhattan Transfer from 1925 and also the USA trilogy from the 1930s. These are all novels that break up plot into the perspectives of multiple characters who inhabit the same space but perceive and remember it in divergent ways. And Manhattan Transfer in particular goes so far in that fragmentation process that there almost isn't a protagonist anymore. The protagonist really is the city itself in a real sense, narratively speaking. Questions of ownership, property, and economic justice in the face of climate change are central to the plot. New York 2140 is bookended by two attempts to overturn the capitalist order that underwrites real estate speculation of the kind that Franklin Garr practices. So Mutt and Jeff, the two computer hackers, hack the international legal code that banking and stock market transactions rely on in the novel's very first scene. So by doing that, they cause a disruption of just a few seconds before their intervention is discovered and reversed. Although they're then, after that, they're kidnapped and held captive for several weeks by shadowy corporate agents so as to discourage them from any further intrusion into the workings of international markets. But that beginning, that failed attempt to overturn the stock market, clearly signals that the technological elite, however progressively minded it might be, won't be able to bring about any lasting change in Robinson's view. But at the end of the novel, an unusual alliance between masses of consumers and the governments of most nations does lead to an incisive change. Instigated by activists like Charlotte and Amelia, millions of customers start to withhold payment on their loans, credits, and mortgages. And that leads to a stock market crash on the model of the one that happened in 2008. In 2140, governments step in and offer to bail out collapsing banks and corporations, just as they did in 2008 and 2009. But this time, they do it on condition that the enterprises cede at least 51% of their stock to the government. Effectively, then, the payment strike in combination with government policy leads to the socialization of major enterprises. And that's, for Robinson, a step in the right direction away from the ubiquitous power of capital. And that's anticipated in the fate of the Metropolitan Life Building itself. The cooperative receives buyout offers at two different moments in the novel, and some of the major characters work really hard to secure a narrow vote against selling the building to a developer. So the future city, as Robinson portrays it, is not just partly underwater because of rising sea levels and climate change. It's also underwater in a more metaphorical financial sense. The novel plays extensively on the superimposition of money and water in its plot and also in its language. So Franklin Garr says at one point, combining a housing index with sea level was one way to view the drowned coastlines, and that was at the heart of what I did. That's what characterizes his financial approach. Stefan and Roberto, the penniless orphans who are often referred to as drowned rats by the adults and repeatedly come close to actually drowning on their diving expeditions, do end up locating a sunken galleon and gold bullion worth $4 billion. So it's sort of, it's sort of 18th or 19th century treasure hunt story embedded in a otherwise very postmodern novel. But in an ironic twist, the historic treasure has to be kept secret and melted down to translate into wealth for them on the capitalist market. The novel's first chapter is entitled The Tyranny of Sunk Costs, of which the citizen presents New York City as an example. So the idea that once you've invested a lot of money in something, even if it turns out to be a bad investment, it's difficult to pull back. Another part is entitled Liquidity Trap, in another pun on money and water. And there's a whole page of the novel that's simply an enumeration of real and made up, present and future idioms and synonyms and ways of talking related to sinking, drowning, drinking, and going underwater. The omnipresence of water in the Robinson's Drowned Manhattan, through these plot twists and the linguistic games, takes on a lot of meanings that include but aren't limited to literal rising sea levels. They also point to social structures, market transactions, and historical memories, all of which shape how the different individuals that populate the novel understand and live with the aquatic city they inhabit. Dealing with climate change in that context isn't just a matter of better technologies, of new construction in devastated urban districts, of biological conservation, of innovative social experiments, or of civic activism, though all of these play really important roles in the plot. It's mainly an issue of justice, of reimagining value itself, the processes by which value is attached and removed from places, practices, objects, and from people themselves, and how value distribution is connected to the distribution of different kinds of power. In New York 2140, Robinson develops an optimistic vision of climate futures on precisely the narrative template of the drowned city that usually leads authors to dystopia. Like Dawson, he sees the flooded city as a starting point for radical social change. But his faith in the power of communities is more limited than Dawson's. And you see that in the metropolitan life building community, which is good at practicing grassroots democracy, but Robinson shows that democracy at a larger scale requires a lot of other things: interventions of technology, personal connections, mass mobilization, and ultimately government intervention. So through his persistent play on water, floods, liquidity, and drowning, Robinson articulates a narrative quest for the more just social order that he's often referred to in other writings as optopia. So that's a neologism with which he wants to avoid the static social structures and political authoritarianism that are often attached to older visions of utopia. Also the idea that a perfect society is the only thing worth striving for. Optopia, in Robinson's view, is the best society you can get, given the circumstances. Perhaps less than perfect, but better than current conditions. And unlike utopia, an optopian order is never established once and for all, but requires continuous struggle and defense against the forces that erode it. So what do these different stories of climate justice and drowned cities tell us then? The most effective environmental storytelling typically approaches an unfamiliar ecological risk through a well-known story. Think of Rachel Carson's use of radioactive fallout as a template for describing chemical toxins in her 1962 Silent Spring. Writers of sci-fi and climate nonfiction, in a similar way, portray the unprecedented risks of climate change and climate injustice through age-old stories of the city going underwater. That creates a tension in that the old story may make the new risk appear less unprecedented than it is, and that's the problem that emerges in Goodell's narrative strategy. Wen Wu and Robinson fall back on the same story template, but use it in more innovative and unsettling ways. Wen Wu, by displacing the flood risk from country to city through a strategy of aquatic surrealism, and Robinson by turning the drowning city scenario from apocalypse to socialist utopia. These imaginative reinventions of an ancient story template in a context of pervasively dystopian visions of our planetary future highlight some of the tools, I think, that narrative offers to develop narrative visions that insist on the necessity of optimism for the future. Thank you.
So the first question we have is from Raj Nandini, who's asking, what is the future of environmental justice and genre as it pertains to literature?
So, I mean, environmental justice can take pretty much, can take on any genre form that people choose to put it into, but there are typically two basic narrative templates that recur. So one of them sort of runs along the lines of what's good for the land is good for the people. And that's the story template that's typically used when the story is about something like pollution or deforestation or soil erosion. If you do something about pollution, air pollution, say, or water pollution, that's good for the people who live there, and it's also good for the non-humans, right? The interests line up. But there's a different story about environmental justice that that makes the problem more complicated. These stories kind of focus a lot on biodiversity conservation and the way in which conservation efforts themselves tend to privilege certain communities and certain interests over others. So when environmental organizations from the global north go into Africa or Latin America to establish a national park or a wildlife refuge, that often means displacement or disenfranchisement of local communities, or at least it has in the past. Currently, you know, in a lot of cities, there's serious concerns with green gentrification. That is, if you put in more parks precisely to address issues of unequal access to green spaces, you in fact gentrify the neighborhood and make it impossible for poorer people to afford them. So those are two sort of basic narratives that recur across a lot of the different genres, but you know, environmental injustice and thinking about environmental justice, you know, even though it often takes the form of speculative fiction, also uses lyrical poetry. It uses plays like Cherry Moraga's Heroes and Saints. It uses the mainstream realist novel. So it can really take on a lot of different genres.
Thank you. The next question is from Caitlin Moore, who's asking about a novel called Floating Worlds, or maybe that's a short story by Carrie Hume. And they're asking, or they're saying, surprising is the lack of urgency or panic. The ecological crisis in this work is not spectacular. It's just one fact among others, given that the author is of Maori descent, for whom apocalypse is not necessarily an anticipated future, but something recurring. What role do speculative works play in moving apocalypse away from this sort of unrealized futurity into the realm of now, in the interest of provoking us to activate our ecological obligations?
Yeah, that's it's a really interesting point, and I'd say two things. One is that environmentalists increasingly are using the sort of the idea of climate apocalypse as being part of the present rather than something to come, as a sense of creating urgency. So there's a presentification of what used to be future scenarios that is actually used to create a sense of urgency. But you're completely right, not just Carrie Hume, but also the Native American philosopher Kyle Powys White have pointed out that white folks, apocalypse for us is in the past. We've lived in it for the last 400 years. You're talking about the wholesale destruction of a cultural world, of ways of life, of environmental resources that a community used to rely on. Well, Native American and indigenous peoples in many other parts of the world too have already experienced that and have lived with it. So maybe there's something to learn from their way of dealing with it. So I think that that's a move that has been, I think, theorized and narrativized in really interesting ways. So apocalypse, not just as a part of our moment, but also actually something of the past. I'd also point people to Frederick Buell's, so Lawrence Buell's younger brother's book, Apocalypse as Way of Life from 2003, where he gives a different twist to that. He says that from the 1980s onward, actually a lot of people, after Chernobyl and Bhopal and Seveso and so forth, came to think of environmental disaster, maybe not apocalypse, but environmental disaster as ongoing crises in the present that are serious, but we move beyond. And he saw that as a diffusion of a sense of apocalypse that he at the time considered dangerous, that he thought that was sort of an accommodation of crisis that could lead to inaction and paralysis. So there's a lot of different takes on what shape that translation of apocalypse into the present and into the past actually takes and how it politically works. And a lot of it depends on who does it and for what audience.
Thank you. The next question is from Sunak, who's asking, what is your opinion on the language patterns of narratives about climate change? Is there any way to genuinely capture the scope to address both rural and semi-rural climate change issues, in addition to the sorts of urban narratives you're talking about?
That's a difficult question, because I'm not sure what is meant by a linguistic perspective here. I mean, of course, there are really good books and films that talk about climate change in areas that are absolutely not urban. One that immediately leaps to mind is Jessamine Ward's Salvage the Bones, which takes place, it's a novel about Hurricane Katrina, but not situated in New Orleans, but in a rural community where people are barely even aware of the hurricane that's coming. And when it does come, think it's going to be a hurricane on the model of what they have experienced in the past. So I'm not sure that the language is necessarily specific, either visual or textual. What is specific is a certain kind of urban plot development that is different for novels that are set in rural areas. But it's not the language itself that I think that is necessarily shared between all of these different urban novels, or that sets them apart from novels set in non-urban settings. So I'm not quite sure how to interpret at what level the person who's asking means linguistic perspective.
And who asked that question? It was Sunak. If you want to follow up on that, you can throw something in the Q&A as well. The next question we have from an anonymous attendee says, "Thank you, Ursula, for such a thought-provoking topic. Is there any way you could expand a little bit on Kim Stanley Robinson's idea of optopia?"
Yeah, so he has used the word, I think, only in the last 15 or 20 years, but I think the idea was there even from his earliest work in the 1980s. So he has, in that time period, he wrote a trilogy called The Three Californias, which has sort of like three very different futures for California. One called the Gold Coast as business as usual, one called the Far Shore as sort of post-nuclear apocalypse, and then one called Pacific Edge is sort of the precursor of what he would later come to theorize as optopia. So you have a little community and other communities like it along the California coast that have actually succeeded in making sustainable communities. But they can't rest on that. They have internal conflicts, and they're constantly being laid upon by developers, by people who have a different vision of the future and want to put in question what cements these utopian communities. So the characters are involved in this constant struggle. So he's trying to show even then that, there is no utopia in the sense of, you know, once you've achieved justice, it's going to be there forever. You have to struggle for it constantly. There's constantly forces that will undermine it. And I mean, this has, you know, when I've discussed it with students over this past year, a lot of them have pointed out to me how much that resonates with current worries over the decline of democracy in various parts of the world. Think of Hungary under Orban, think of Turkey under Erdogan, think of Brazil under Bolsonaro, or think of, you know, the United States under Trump. In all of which cases you have established democracies, but whose institutions and procedures were and are being seriously undermined. So democracy is something that you have to constantly struggle for. And in the same way, Robinson would argue whatever, you know, socialist or other kind of utopia you can imagine will not be in place once and for all. And it certainly also cannot be as homogeneous and authoritarian as some of the older utopias are imagined to be. I mean, think of Bellamy's Looking Backward, or even further back, Thomas More's Utopia. Well, you have societies that, you know, are juster and fairer in some sense, but also rely on on the authoritarian imposition of those structures. So Robinson, Ursula K. Le Guin, many other writers are aware that that can't work, you know, in the heterogeneous societies that we have in the future, that there will always be clashing visions of what the good and the just society and the good city looks like. And you have to have mechanisms to deal with those conflicts, and at least to make those different opinions heard, even if not all of them can be acted upon. So it's a much more complicated and ambiguous and ambivalent vision of what, not the perfect, but a better society might look like.
Thank you. We have one more question that came in. It's a follow-up from Sunak and the question about language. And they're saying what they mean by language paradigm is, what is the role of vernaculars, dialects, and local languages to address climate issues on a global scale?
Oh, that's a really interesting question that I'm not sure I have a great answer to. But it's a super interesting question because, of course, in a lot of the high modernist urban novels that some of the current urban visions are modeled on, the integration of different languages, i.e. vernaculars, professional languages, different media languages, advertising languages, was a crucial part of the project. For example, in Alfred Döblin's Berlin Alexanderplatz, or, you know, something like Carlos Fuentes' La Región Más Transparente, which has been translated into English as Where the Air is Clear, which is a sort of deep dive into the present and history of Mexico City, that was published in 1958 as sort of a latter-day sequel to this. And of course, in a lot of the of novels about African megacities, like, you know, I'm thinking here of Nnedi Okorafor's Lagoon, which is a speculative novel about Lagos that allegorizes climate change in interesting ways. The integration of vernaculars, different versions of English or of Spanish, and the integration of indigenous languages does play a really interesting role. Not sure that that's true of all of them, though. I mean, there is the presence of different languages, but I'm not sure that that's true, for example, of a film like Wen Vo's, where the language is sort of lyrical and it is sort of an avant-garde visual language that doesn't pay that much attention to different vernaculars. So I think that it's a really interesting question. And I mean, I think in some of the more interesting novels, that is certainly true. And there is that integration, but I don't think it's true of all of them. But really super interesting question. I'll think more about this integration of, particularly of vernaculars. I mean, there are some writers who, of course, push that to the point, like Karen Yamashita, who has one novel called Circle K Cycles, that's 1/3 in English, 1/3 in Portuguese, and 1/3 in Japanese. Limits your readership a little bit right there. And there are examples like that, but those are extreme, I think. So I'd have to think more about that particular aspect of the language. Thank you for
Ursula,
that suggestion.
I might have one question. just to pursue a bit more the question of the complex politics you're just referring to, with your discussion about the Atlantis metaphor, as you're calling Sir Francis Bacon, just checking in its data, discovered what I didn't know, but you don't no doubt do. There's an American journal called The New Atlantis, which is a sort of skeptical, conservative, Christian-based journal about science and technology, partly environmental issues, but also the limits, the ethical limits of biotech, that kind of thing. I wonder what, and my impression is that probably most people from outside would think, oh, the whole ecological emphasis is all very, post-capitalist and anti, but here's a journal that's using that very imagery and taking out a somewhat different position. Does that seem of interest to you, and how significant is that kind of counter move?
I think it's really significant. I mean, there's nothing in the form of the works that I've discussed, or in the reclaiming of an ecotopia that necessarily makes it correspond to some of the more progressive visions that are currently being articulated in the North American scene. And the environmental movement has, of course, a mixed history. I mean, in Germany, there was, in the 1970s, actually a very distinctive wing of the emergent environmental movement that was subscribed to Christian and conservative values. And they formed part of the Green Party. When the Green Party was formed in 1981, at the beginning, there was that conservative wing, which was then crowded out. And those people left the party after a few years, because they felt that there was no room for their kind of vision. I think conservatives have had more trouble laying claim to environmentalism for, I think, a couple of reasons. I mean, one is that that Christian rhetoric has quite often been deployed to say that, okay, whatever, and not just Christian rhetoric, also Islamic rhetoric, that where, one counter to discourses about biodiversity conservation is whatever happens is willed by Allah, and if that species is willed to go extinct, it'll go extinct. So sort of taking human agency out of the picture. There are certain versions of Christian rhetoric against environmentalism. Remember James Watt, Reagan's energy secretary of state, who said that, it didn't matter that we, whether we stewarded the earth or not, that the second coming was going to set an end to this anyway. So I think the more religiously inflected, and particularly Christian, but also in some cases Islamic inflected visions of it, struggle with adjudicating how to assess, God's agency and human agency when it comes to the evolution of nature. There's, of course, a different strain of Christianity, and there's a lot of movements around the world. In Latin America, some of the most prominent conservationist and environmentalist impulses over the last 20 years have come out of indigenous cosmologies. All of the rhetoric and the discourses and ideas about the buen vivir that have come out of Andean indigenous cosmologies and have shaped the new constitutions of Ecuador and Bolivia draw on non-Christian, religious, spiritual conceptions of the natural world, and have proven, but again, politically progressive on the whole in that particular context. In the United States, there is, of course, a movement, in fundamental Christianity to sort of reclaim the idea of human stewardship of the earth in a more positive way. So the fact that something is religiously inflected also doesn't mean that it's necessarily conservative, or what in the United States would be considered right-wing, which is anyway a bit atypical on the international scale. But you're right to point to that. Robinson is somebody who's a dyed-in-the-wool Marxist. So for him, the optopia or utopia clearly has to move away from capitalism as an economic structure and into some variety of socialism. But there's of course a lot of writers who don't necessarily agree with that. But I mean, I also think that what you bring up is super interesting, because I think the reason why so many writers around the world are currently unable to imagine the future along any other than apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic or dystopian lines is precisely that the issue of what the better or perfect society would look like is so much in question. And there are so many competing visions of it. I mean, I think that's why one of the reasons that dystopia or apocalypse has sort of become the fallback position, where you can say what we don't want without necessarily having to say what you do want. I think that's where we sort of need more of these positive views. And I think in recent years, there has been a massive move in among environmentalists and environmental communicators to move away from disaster and really emphasize more positive visions. But that does run into this issue that the positive visions are not necessarily identical, or they can be conflicting. And we see that, you know, around the Green New Deal and things like that, right?
Well, I think we are out of time, in fact, of this very, very rich talk and very stimulating. And I recall the new Atlantis. Bacon is really going to be a university for him finally. And perhaps for us, the Utopian Ideal can be an online institute around the world with no carbon footprint, whatever. And thank you so much, Ursula, for taking the time at this early morning in California to join us today. It's really great talking. Great to see you again.